first of all, on the congressional debt, there are many people who said we should pay Americans before we paid foreigners. People thought that, we should take America first. Foreigners should come after we pay off the debt. So that some people were saying we should distinguish between the debt we owe to foreigners and the debt we owe to Americans. And so that, in the discussion, that idea is out there. People have talked about that possibility of dealing with the debt of Congress. And then about the debt of states, there's a lot of different ideas. And as I told you, states are dealing with their debts differently. Every state has its own policy for dealing with the debt, and some of them are different. And as I said, some states are doing a very good job of paying off their debt, although to do it they've had to raise taxes and are causing great hardship for their people, but at least they're meeting the obligation to their bondholders, to the people that had loaned them the money during the war. And other states have taken the opposite extreme, in the example I gave you, which was Rhode Island, where they just printed paper money and they said, woohoo, it's all done, we don't have to worry about it, which is not very responsible. And yeah, it's nice to screw over rich people, but you can't screw people over in a republic. You can't pick out some people and say, well, we're going to just take your money. But the issue is that some states have large debts and some states have small debts. And I talked about this to you before. The generalization that we can make, and it's a generalization, doesn't work perfectly, but that northern states generally had larger debts than small states. And the reason for that is pretty simple. States had borrowed money to pay the cost of the war, and the war was not the same in every state. In some states, there was a lot more serious fighting than in others, and that meant that states had to have their militias do a lot more fighting, so they had to borrow a lot more money. So states where there had been a lot of the fighting had very large debts. States where there was less fighting had smaller debts. And the generalization is that most of the large debt states were in the north and the small debt states were in the south. Now that's a little simplification, and if you went down and looked at it one at a time in detail, you'd have to say, well, there's some exceptions and da-da-da. But we'll just go with that generalization for this class. So, as a general rule, the northern states, the large debt states, want Congress to take over their debts. They want the federal government to pay off their state debts. But southern states don't. Southern states figure correctly they're going to get less money from a federal takeover of debts. They don't have many debts to take over. But they're going to have to pay taxes at the same rate of northerners. And I know, as an example, some of the leaders of Virginia had calculated, and Virginia is a southern state, it's a low debt state. They calculated that for every dollar that they got back if the federal government took over their state debt, they would pay $5 in taxes, with the money going to northern states, which had the bigger debts. So what Hamilton is proposing here, funding an assumption, the word assumption means that the federal government is going to assume, that is, take over the debt of the states. So that proposal was very popular in the North and very unpopular in the South, and especially with Virginia, and in particular with Virginia's two leading politicians, leading leaders, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Jefferson is the Secretary of State. He's a member of cabinet with Hamilton. They are colleagues in Washington's cabinet. James Madison is a member of the House of Representatives. He's Hamilton's former colleague, co-author of the Federalist Papers, the two men who had cooperated together, who are the two primary people for getting the Constitution and longtime friends and collaborators on the Constitution. But now Madison turns against Jefferson because he's a Virginian, he's a Southerner, and he goes along with his senior colleague Jefferson in opposing Hamilton's assumption. It's a sectional issue. It's North versus South, and Hamilton from New York is supporting the North, so the South opposes him. Southerners oppose him. And Congress, which had sort of been united, sort of been operating on that model that the Founding Fathers wanted of a non-partisan Congress, non-political, it became divided. It split. It split into two parties. And I've already used the name Federalist for one of the parties. And let me clarify, this word Federalist is a little bit confusing because we use it in two different ways. We use it for the people who had favored the Constitution, and now it becomes the name of a political party, which is different. Some of the people who had been Federalists before are now leaders of the party. That's Hamilton. Hamilton is going to be the leader of the Federalist movement for the Constitution, and now he's the leader of the Federalist Party. But James Madison, who was one of the also prominent Federalists, the author of the Virginia Plan, one of Hamilton's colleagues on the Federalist Papers, Madison now turns against him and is opposed to assumption. The two of them had a personal falling out. They were no longer friends. And then, of course, supporting Madison was Jefferson. The issue is being decided by Congress, and Madison is in Congress. Jefferson was not. He was in the Executive Department, he's Secretary of State, but he was a friend of Madison, and the two of them privately worked together to plan opposition to Hamilton's plan. And so they became the leaders of the opposition party, and eventually they adopted for themselves the name Republicans. They started calling themselves the Republican Party as opposed to the Federalist Party. But that word Federalist, again, is just the name of the party, not to be confused with the Federalists who had agitated for the Constitution. Some of them are the same, but some are not, so it's a different lineup. And this is a very bitter fight in Congress over assumption. And it's a fight between Hamilton and the Federalist Party, Jefferson and Madison and the Republican Party. Eventually they worked out a compromise. Eventually they worked out a deal. And this is a deal that we don't know the details of. We think we do, but we're not sure. We think there was a dinner at the home of Jefferson, and Jefferson, incidentally, was a widower. His wife had died many years earlier, and he never remarried. So he's got a home that he's taking care of as a single dad, and he invited two longtime friends, Hamilton and Madison, to his house for dinner, and we know they had that dinner. We don't know what they talked about, but we think they worked out a deal there where the issue was where we would locate the capital city. That was another issue. It had nothing to do with the dad. It had nothing to do with anything else. That's a separate issue. Congress is debating that, and that's also a sectional issue. That's a North versus South. Northerners wanted the capital in the North because they figured the capital is going to be very distinguished. It'll be a major city, and it'll be a positive thing to have. So Northerners wanted the capital in the North. Southerners wanted it in the South. So that had been an issue, and so they worked out a deal with Jefferson sort of providing the food, that Hamilton and Madison worked out a deal where they would agree that we would allow assumption to go forward, and then we would put the national capital in the South, it's actually going to straddle the boundary of the Potomac River, which is the boundary between Maryland and Virginia, two southern states. So a deal was arranged, a compromise. It's a bargain. It's a trade-off. But eventually, the South, Madison and other Southerners, came to accept the idea of assumption in return for the capital in Washington, which is in the District of Columbia, which is in the South. So that settled that issue. But more troublesome was the question of funding. And here's the issue behind this. In the years since the money had originally been borrowed during the war, Congress borrowed all that money during the war, and they issued bonds as sort of a surety. I mean, a bond is like it's like an IOU. It's an obligation to pay. They'd issued all those bonds, and then they had never paid interest or principal on the bonds. The bond says you're going to pay interest at such and such a rate for so many years, and then pay it off, and da da da. And we haven't been doing that. We're in arrears on our debts, and that's one of the biggest things that's dragging the country down under the Articles, that Congress could not pay its debts because it didn't have any money. During the years that the Articles had gone on, many of the people who had originally loaned the money to Congress got very discouraged about whether they were ever going to get paid back or not. They started looking around and they see Congress is not paying its debts. It's in arrears, it's behind, it's totally in default on its obligations, it's not meeting its obligations. And many people said they're never going to get it. This is a mess. I'm going to bail. I'm going to sell my bonds now and get what I can, and rather, get some cash now, and rather than wait around and never get anything, I might as well sell now while I still can. Well, there's still a market. So there had been a market. In several American cities, there were places where people could come together in a classic market situation. They could come together, people who had bonds they wanted to sell, and people who were willing to buy them. And so it's like a market. It's like the modern day stock market. It's a bond market, similar. And people are just sort of bidding as to what they're going to pay and what the price of the bond is going to be. And as that goes on, the price of bonds keeps going down. More and more people are not wanting to keep their bonds. It's looking like Congress is never going to pay it off. People get discouraged. They want to sell their bonds. They're willing to take a lower and lower price. The price keeps getting lower and lower. As a generalization, just as sort of a summary, we can say that by 1790, the price of a bond in an open market, based on supply and demand, the going price for bonds was approximately 50% of the face value of the amount that the person had originally loaned to Congress during the very difficult years of the war, when lending money to Congress was a life-threatening event. You're running a risk that you're going to lose your money, you'll lose your life, and it's hard to know which would be worse. So people that loan money to Congress, and many of them are now selling their bonds for less money than that because they just give up. So many people had bought the bond. At any given day, the people who owned the bonds that day had paid varying prices for the bonds. Some people who had bought the bonds back during the war, the ones who actually loaned the money to Congress, may have paid full price. And some of those people have still held on to the bonds, and they paid full price, and they still own it. But other people had bought the bonds at far lower prices as the price of bonds kept going down, down, down steadily over several years. And people who had bought the bonds recently, the most current owners, people who had bought a bond at the market price, had only paid 50 cents for a $1 bond, or whatever, $500 for a $1,000 bond. So there's all these different prices that people had paid. And one of the things that Madison suggested as a member of Congress, debating Hamilton's plan, he said we should try to figure out what people had actually paid for the bond. And everybody agrees we have to pay them back. Nobody is questioning whether we should ignore those debts. Nobody wants to be a debt writer and just say, like they did in Rhode Island, just say, forget it, we're not going to pay you back, too bad, go away. We got to pay the debt. We got to pay the debts. Everybody says as a matter of honesty and integrity, the United States has to pay its debts. But the question is, what's the price you're going to pay? Are you going to pay them the price that they paid for it? And that's what Madison is saying. And whatever that is. So for some people it's going to be the full price, and then there'll be other people all in between if they bought it a year ago, 2 years ago, whenever they bought it, whatever the price was at that time. If they bought it yesterday, they paid about half for it, about half price for it. And he said, that's what people should get back. They should be, we have to pay them back, but we should pay them what they paid for it. And if they paid less for it, then we should pay the person who paid more for it the difference. It's a little bit complicated, but to make it simple, if somebody had paid Congress $1,000, had bought the bond when it was fresh, and had paid $1,000 for it, and now then they sold it yesterday for $500, they sold it at a loss of $500. What Madison is proposing is that we should pay $500 to the current owner who paid $500 for it, and then pay the difference of $500 to the person who had lost that much money by selling it early. So that idea is out there. Madison and some of the other Republican members of Congress have been trying to argue we need to set up a mechanism by which we ensure that everybody gets back the money that they invested. If you put $1,000 into a bond during the war, and then you sold it for $500, where you got that $500, then Congress should give you the other $500, so that everybody gets back what they actually paid. And that idea has been floating around. And it was not included in Hamilton's plan for a funding. By funding, he means we're going to issue new bonds, and we're going to pay all current owners the full face value of the bond, regardless of what they paid for it, along with interest. So that funding means it's going to be full payment of all bonds, both congressional and state, incidentally, at full face value. We will redeem them, we will fund them at their original face value, regardless of what the person paid for it. Now, think about this. It means that people who bought the bonds recently, in the last few days just before this happens, the people who bought them for $500, they paid $500, and they're going to get back $1,000. And that was something that Madison said was wrong, 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 and why we should not adopt Hamilton's plan for funding. Well, we'll look at this debate in a few minutes.